There is a precise moment in the ascent of every great man when his greatest asset becomes his lethal liability. Consider the structure of a cathedral. As the spires reach higher, they require a wider and stronger foundation to sustain the weight. But in the architecture of the human soul, power works in reverse. As a man rises, his foundation narrows. He stops listening to the earth beneath him and starts listening only to the wind whistling around his own head. This is the mechanics of hubris. It is not merely arrogance. It is a blinding disconnect from reality. It is the psychological state where a man believes he can negotiate with gravity. To understand this is to understand the secret mechanism of history. It explains why empires fall and why fortunes vanish. To master this understanding is to inoculate yourself against the disease that kills kings. We look to the ultimate patient zero of this pathology, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a man who conquered the world with mathematics, and then lost it all to a metaphor. He did not lose because he was outfought. He lost because he mistook his own ego for the hand of God. To understand the collapse, we must first respect the ascent. The Napoleon of 1796 was not a madman. He was a calculator. He was a creature of pure, ruthless pragmatism. When he took command of the army of Italy, he did not give rousing speeches about destiny. He looked at the boots of his soldiers. He counted their rations. He calculated the speed of march against the terrain. This was the source of his early power. Reality was his ally. He studied maps with the obsessiveness of a neurotic. He knew that a cannonball travels in a predictable arc, and that an army marches on its stomach. There was no magic here. There was only hyper-competence. This version of Napoleon is the model for anyone seeking power. You observe the world as it is. You leverage the physics of the situation. You remove emotion from the equation. But success is a hallucinogen. When you win once, you attribute it to preparation. When you win 10 times, you attribute it to talent. When you win 100 times against impossible odds, you stop believing in preparation or talent. You begin to believe in destiny. You start to think that the rules of the universe have been suspended specifically for you. By 1804, the calculator was dying. The dreamer was taking control. The coronation of Napoleon as emperor was the public funeral of the pragmatist. When he took the crown from the Pope and placed it on his own head, he was sending a signal to his own subconscious. He was declaring that his authority came from no one but himself. He was no longer a servant of the French Republic. He was the state. Psychologists call this the winner effect. It is a chemical change in the brain, a surge of testosterone and dopamine that follows a victory. It increases risk tolerance. It sharpens focus. It makes you feel invincible. In moderation, it is the fuel of champions. In excess, it is a death sentence. Napoleon had been winning for 10 years. His brain had been rewired by a decade of constant adoration and conquest. He ceased to see human beings as variables with their own wills. He saw them as pieces on a chessboard that he alone controlled. This is the danger of being the smartest person in the room for too long. You stop checking your work. You stop asking for dissenting opinions because experience has taught you that everyone else is wrong and you are right. This was the trap. The brilliance that allowed him to outmaneuver the Austrians at Austerlitz in 1805 became the arrogance that blinded him. He looked at the map of Europe, and he did not see nations with their own histories and pride. He saw a system to be organized. He implemented the continental system not just as an economic blockade against Britain, but as an assertion of total control. He demanded that the entire continent stop breathing without his permission. This is where the geopolitical reality began to fracture. You can conquer a capital city with gunpowder, but you cannot conquer the laws of economics with a decree. He believed his will was stronger than market forces. He believed he could starve Britain into submission while Europe suffered the costs. He ignored the smugglers. He ignored the grumbling of his allies. He ignored the reality that people will not starve quietly for a foreign emperor's glory. The turning point was not on the battlefield. It was in the mind. By 1811, Napoleon was surrounded by yes men. This is the inevitable court of the egoist. Competent advisors are purged because they offer the one thing the ego cannot survive, which is truth. They were replaced by sycophants who reinforced his delusions. He began to rewrite the past to suit the present. He spoke of his star. He believed a supernatural force guided his steps. This is the shift from strategy to mysticism. A strategist asks what happens if it rains. A mystic assumes the sun will shine because he demands it. Then came the decision that sealed his fate. The invasion of Russia. Looking back at 1812, it seems like madness. But to Napoleon, it was a logical necessity. Russia had disobeyed him. His ego could not tolerate a fracture in his system of control. To let Alexander I defy him was to admit that his power had limits. And the one thing a narcissist cannot accept is a limit. His advisors warned him. The logistics were impossible. The geography was a nightmare. The winter was a killer. Napoleon dismissed them. He famously said that he would find peace in Moscow. He was no longer fighting the Russian army. He was fighting the map itself. He believed he could intimidate the geography. He assembled the Grand Army. 600,000 men, the largest military force Europe had ever seen. It was a monument to his vanity. But an army that size is a logistical beast. It requires mountains of food and oceans of water. Napoleon the calculator would have known this. Napoleon the emperor ignored it. The campaign of 1812 is the perfect laboratory for studying hubris. As the army marched into the vast Russian emptiness, the enemy did not fight. They retreated. They burned the land. They denied Napoleon the one thing his ego craved. A decisive battle. A moment of glory. He kept marching. He marched past the point of no return. He marched into the deep summer heat that killed his horses by the thousands. He marched into the dust that choked his men. He was chasing a ghost. He believed that if he just captured Moscow, the Tsar would beg for mercy. He projected his own psychology onto his enemy. He thought the Tsar would break, because he himself would break under such pressure. He failed to understand the Russian soul. He reached Moscow in September. He found it empty. He waited in the Kremlin for a surrender that never came. He sat in the Tsar's palace and waited for the validation of his genius. Instead, he got fire. The Russians burned their own holy city rather than let him have it. This was the moment reality finally shattered the delusion. But it was too late. He had lingered too long waiting for an applause that was not coming. The winter was approaching. The retreat from Moscow is a horror story written by arrogance. The temperature dropped. The snow fell. The Grand Army dissolved. Men froze to death while walking. They ate their own horses. They turned to cannibalism. Of the 600,000 who entered Russia, less than 100,000 returned. Napoleon rode in a carriage. He was insulated from the worst of the cold, but he could not insulate himself from the truth. He had sacrificed 500,000 souls on the altar of his vanity. And yet even then he did not blame himself. He blamed the weather. He blamed his subordinates. He blamed treason. The ego has an infinite capacity for defense. It will rewrite reality rather than admit error. You would think this would be the end. But the ego is a resilient parasite. It feeds on hope even when the body is dying. Napoleon was exiled to Elba, a small island for a small man. But he could not accept his new dimensions. He escaped. He returned to France in 1815. This period is known as the 100 Days. It is often romanticized as a heroic last stand. Psychologically, it was a relapse. It was the addict returning to the needle. He marched on Paris, and the army defected to him. Vive l'Empereur rang out again. For a brief moment, the drug worked. The dopamine hit was massive. He believed his star had returned. He believed he could fight all of Europe combined. But the world had changed. The other powers of Europe had learned. They had studied his tactics. They had adopted his core system. They were no longer afraid of the myth. They were fighting a man, not a god. Waterloo was not a tragedy of bad luck. It was the mathematical result of a depleted system. Napoleon was sick. He was sluggish. He made tactical errors he never would have made in 1796. He delayed his attack waiting for the ground to dry. He underestimated Wellington. He ignored the Prussians approaching on his flank. He was fighting the battle he wanted to fight, not the battle that was in front of him. When the old guard broke that evening, it was the final collapse of the illusion. The elite shock troops of the empire retreated. The invincible had been conquered. The final chapter is the most revealing. Exiled to St. Helena, a rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles from nowhere. There was no escape this time. Here the man was stripped away until only the ego remained. He spent his final years dictating his memoirs. He did not spend this time reflecting on his mistakes. He spent it polishing his statue. He dictated a version of history where he was the victim of British treachery and incompetent marshals. He could not let go of the narrative. He argued with his captors over protocol. He demanded to be addressed as emperor even when his empire was a rat-infested house on a wind-swept cliff. It is pathetic, and it is deeply human. He died in 1821. His last words were France, the army, Josephine. Even in death, he was trapped in the identity he had constructed. He could not return to being just a man. Why does this matter to you? You are not commanding armies. You are not invading Russia. But you are fighting a war. You are fighting for status, for wealth, for competence. And the mechanism that destroyed Napoleon is waiting for you. It starts when you begin to believe your own marketing. It starts when you fire the person who questions your data. It starts when you attribute your lucky breaks to your genius. It starts when you think the rules of finance or relationships or health do not apply to you because you are special. We live in an age of digital narcissism. We curate our lives to look like victories. We build mini empires of followers and likes. We are all susceptible to the hubris that says we are the main character of reality. But reality has no main characters. It only has survivors. The market does not care about your confidence. The virus does not care about your net worth. The road does not care about your driving skills. When you stop respecting the external variables, you are already marching toward Moscow. The only cure for this disease is a ruthless commitment to the truth. You must cultivate the voice of the calculator. You must surround yourself with people who are not afraid to tell you that you are wrong. You must constantly audit your own assumptions. True power is not the belief that you can control everything. True power is the understanding of what you can control and the respect for what you cannot. Napoleon wanted to be a god. He ended up as a cautionary tale. He conquered the world, but he could not conquer the voice in his head that said more. In the end, history is a ledger. It balances itself without emotion. Ambition is the asset that gets you in the game, but hubris is the debt that bankrupts you. You have the potential for greatness. You have the tools to build your own empire. But remember the snows of Russia. Remember the silence of St. Helena. The higher you climb, the colder the wind blows. And gravity is always waiting. Do not fall in love with your own reflection. It is the one enemy you cannot outmaneuver. Look at your current path. Where are you ignoring the data because it contradicts your desires? Identify that blind spot. Turn around before the winter sets in.